barbarians, shut up. Get to work. Okay. So race as a social construct, as a way of assigning identity, in society, that's a relatively modern phenomenon. So race actually is in your head, it's not in biology. Race doesn't explain anything. To look at someone and to define their so-called race, it doesn't explain anything about their potential. Does that make sense? You don't know what that person, who that person is, or what that person is capable of. If you think you do know, what is that? That's racism or prejudice. That's prejudge. That's what that is. So the question is, how did that get in your head? That's a sociological question. So I always like to put race in quotation marks because it's really illusory. It's not a fixed category. It's in motion. It's in flux. We're working our way through it. And I like to challenge my students to break out of that box, think outside of the confines of racial categorization. I don't think it's ultimately very helpful. But we're stuck with it, unfortunately. So that kind of language is still used in the present. So when you have occupations that are splintered across the American employment landscape according to race and ethnicity, you're going to get tension, you're going to get competition, you're going to get an impact on labor militancy. If, for example, the Irish strike and they're scabbed or replaced with Chinese, what is that going to do to the ethnic antagonisms that were already there due to ghettoization between the Irish and the Chinese? It intensifies it. And the same can be said of any two groups who see themselves in competition. So the bosses actually use this to their advantage. Does that make sense? They use this color-coded system, frankly, to their advantage. And they promote it. So they want people to be divided along ethnic or racial lines. It serves their interests. So one of the things American labor has to learn to do, and it does do this, Now, you've heard of a song, perhaps, from the Civil Rights Movement era called We Shall Overcome. That song is actually born into the labor movement. Those ideas come out of the labor movement. The song was written by Pete Seeger, for goodness sakes, at the Highlander Folk School, which is all about class solidarity. Class. You dig what I'm saying? So overcoming these divisions which are largely illusory and work in the service of the employer class. So the impact on labor militancy has been to dilute it. The impact on wages has been to do what? To drive them down. And so this is one of the great tasks of the American labor movement, is to organize in solidarity across these divisions to create better conditions for everyone, regardless of gender or national origin or perceptions of race. Now, that's the side of America that I'm most proud of. I don't know about you. When I think of America, that's what makes me swell with pride, that kind of thing. That kind of thing. That's who we are too. Now we have to look a little bit at the situation for African Americans. One of the tragedies of American racism is as follows. You know now that Sylvester Stallone, whose actual name is Stallone, right? It's anglicized a bit. Sylvester Stallone is considered a white person. You know who Sinead O'Connor is? I'm not that old, am I? Sinead O'Connor is considered a white person. Paul McCartney is considered to be a white person. Okay, that senator from Connecticut who is now an independent, he ran for vice president with Al Gore. He's Jewish American. Can't think of his name for some reason. Anybody help me? Anyway, he's Jewish American, and he's considered a white person. But there was a time, not so long ago, in American history when none of those persons would be considered white, and they'd be discriminated against as a minority. But now they've been assimilated into whiteness. And now you could put Sinead O'Connor right up against Tony Blair and you would say they're both white folks. So how did they assimilate? How did the Irish become white? How did the Jews become white? How did the Italians become white? Do you know how? It's one of the tragedies of American racial politics and ethnic chauvinism.
Denying their culture?
Okay. They did this by climbing up over on the backs of people not from Europe. So you climb on the backs of African Americans, you climb up on the backs of Asian immigrants, you climb up on the backs of native people or peoples from Mexico. You climb up on their backs, appealing to the middle class for acceptance into whiteness by saying what? Let us in the house because we ain't who? You dig what I'm saying? And that's frankly one of the tragedies of American racial ethnic chauvinism. And it has facilitated the assimilation into whiteness of other European groups. So, persons of African descent, persons of Asian descent, native peoples, peoples from Mexico, they can't change their skin color. Does that make sense? So it's much more difficult for them to assimilate over long periods of time, much more difficult to assimilate into the middle class. That's certainly true for blacks in the course of this country's history who had come out of slavery. Look at number 18. In the late 19th century, here's the statistic, about 90% of African American people lived in the South. Now, they're suffering from Jim Crow terror. Remember what that is, right?
Separate but equal.
Yes, that's what they say.
Yeah.
But it's really a racial caste system enforced by terror. You recall those photographic images you may have seen of the postcards? So in other words, if you're an African American living in Alabama, is there some push there? Would you like to get out of Alabama? Yeah. The problem is, for black people, you have to understand, there's no corresponding pull. Okay? In other words, you go up to Chicago from Alabama, is anyone going to hire you? It's the year 1890? No, no one's going to hire you. You're going to be on the very margins of the margins. You're going to be living in a ghettoized part of town, the poorest kind of housing, under the worst kinds of conditions, and the lowest possible jobs you can imagine. So there's no corresponding pull. So about 10% of black people live in the North, but they've been there all along, you know? So that situation remains fairly constant, that 90 to 10 sort of ratio. And we're going to get to this in a future chapter. I'm just giving you a heads up as to what's coming. The first time that's going to start to change is in the context of World War I. World War I opens up a pull. World War II opens up a pull for black people. As the immigrant waves in Europe, what happens to them? They stop coming at a time when the economy is expanding. All right, you got me? So again, race, class, ethnicity, power, all these things have to be factored in when you begin to understand the patterns of American life for everybody. Okay, let's look at the late 19th century and the rise of the public school system, or I should say the expansion of a public school system that had begun in New England about 30, 40 years before. New England. The first normal schools were in New England. Well, what a surprise. That's the first place in the country that began to industrialize, right? So what's the role and function of a public school in an industrializing economy? Why don't they have public schools in an agrarian economy? Like a farm community. Why don't you have public schools there?
No need for it.
There's no need for it. Why?
Because they're spending all their time out on the farms.
You don't need to be literate to milk cows, to thresh wheat. Does that make sense? Okay. But if you're going to operate complex, heavy machinery, you better learn to read the instructions properly, at least at a nominal level. If you're going to read a bill of lading, or if you're going to try to understand the rules of the particular industry you're in, you've got to be able to read. And you have to have basic levels of numeracy too, if you're going to operate machinery, in a certain and particular context. So you've got to be educated at least up through what grade? At least the 8th grade, right? Now, these public schools are not interested in turning out Spinoza or Dostoevsky. You dig what I'm saying? They're interested in turning out people who have basic level skills in terms of numeracy and literacy. They're not interested in philosophy. They're not interested in literature, these kind of abstractions. It's mostly going to be basic literacy, numeracy, and a heavy dose of what? Heavy on the patriotism, baby, right? Because when it comes to war, who's going to make up the rank and file of the American military services? These very folks. So, for example, in this context, did I mention this already? Or maybe it was the other class. This is the first time the Pledge of Allegiance was legislated across America for young ones from the 5th grade up, kindergarten up, to say this in the classroom. The context was rapid industrialization and immigration. So again, it's about standardizing the curriculum, laying it heavy on the patriotism. Now,